Tiger.
Here we go.
I feel like a locomotive, sipping, drinking Arizona. Mixtape just around the corner, did a lot in California. Can't wait to drop this on you. Yeah, they gon' have fun with that. Smash like Songam, and my songs gon' break through like a running back.
Hello and welcome to the podcast that is always up to speed with hip hop. Joining me today in the studio from Vibe Magazine, Master D, Mark Daly. We are here to break down the latest 21 Savage Drake album, Her Loss. My friend, the album was released 17 minutes ago. Where do we start? This is an epic. We're actually here to talk about Formula One, but I had to get that off my chest because I'm excited.
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, who would be, right? I mean, should we just kind of like throw the whole thing on pause and come back in a couple hours, or maybe tomorrow night?
that would be such great podcasting. I don't know if our listeners would prefer that or a weather update from the Pacific Northwest, where it's very cold and very wet.
Yeah, and it was snowing up at my place earlier, and it's just
No
cold and
way.
miserable. Yeah. We had about probably an inch or so, and now it's just all turned to rain. And I'm kind of worried about the nice trees that we have out in the garden because they haven't really lost all the leaves yet. So you got the combination of like a little bit of snow, leaves, and now it's getting really heavy. So I'm hoping I'm not going to lose any branches overnight. I tried to shake it off, but all I did was get covered in wet, soggy snow. So there's that. You can go now. You can keep talking again.
I've got nothing. I'm ready.
You got nothing.
How do I
really
react to your description of a wet, soggy tree? Like, it wasn't like you were setting up. Maybe you were setting up a punchline for a joke, but my friend,
not really.
we have stuff to talk about. We're right
Sure.
in the midst of a Formula One triple header. I guess we're back in Brazil this weekend. Super exciting. I think that's a race both of us thoroughly enjoy. And the news just keeps coming. So we've got some juicy stuff to get through. But all of that aside, before we get started, how are you?
I'm good. I'm just looking forward to getting to the weekend here. I mean, it's already Thursday night, so Friday is it's basically here. Gonna be a busy day tomorrow, but hey, this weekend, we got Formula One to look forward to. I know the championships and everything are decided, but hey, it's still racing to look forward to. That's the main thing. There's still NFL, there's NBA, there's all sorts of fun stuff to watch this weekend. And how about yourself? You are like, well, you're always pretty energetic, but you see even like a little more perky than usual, especially for a guy that's just transitioned back to the office. I mean, your days must be kind of like long and unfun at the moments.
Seemingly more time in the office, which I think we knew was probably all going to come. So that 2.5 year period of kind of rolling out of bed in my pajamas and working from my desk in the basement under a pile of blankets is seemingly at least partially behind me, but that's totally cool. But yeah, I'm a little bit amped up today. Obviously the Drake album's out, which I'm super excited about. And then tomorrow I'm actually going to the US for business for the day. So that's cool. Pop across the border. I think our listeners know you and I are like 45 minutes from the US border. We could be in Seattle in a couple of hours. So just popping across the border. But other than that, I'm in a good mood. We sit here in North America, Major League Baseball, the World Series is on. We're halfway through the NFL season. We just had the trade deadline. The NBA season's in full swing. The NHL season's in full swing. If you're a sports fan, there's a lot to be excited and stimulated about right now.
Oh, exactly. And it's also such a cool time of year because there's so many great holidays and things coming up over the next couple of months. So it doesn't matter who you are, where you are, there's something to look forward to. And talking about things to look forward to, I know everybody's just dying to get a championship update here. So we'll just do that real quickly. After Max winning last weekend in Mexico, now leading the standings with 416, obviously crowned world champion a couple of weeks ago. Sergio Perez is second with 285 points ahead of Charles Leclerc. George Russell is fourth, and Lewis Hamilton has now leapfrogged Carlos Sainz to is now fifth in the championship with 216. Over on the constructor side, still a totally unchanged situation. There, Red Bull 696, Ferrari 487, Mercedes 447, Alpine 153, and McLaren and 146. So there you go. And well, let's do a fantasy update
Let's
because we're
do
getting
it.
down to the end of this and it's going to be fun. We're going to be able to give away some prizes in a couple of weeks, which is exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. And the crazy thing about the Formula One Fantasy League is that the top 10, I guess the top 10 competitors right now, or those that are currently ranked in the top 10, are only separated by 103 points. So anyone and anything can happen at this point. But to give everyone a quick update right now from the UK, Andrew T is on top with 4,121 points, followed by Aaron K, Whitman R, Thaddeus F, Janko West, Radek W from Poland, Marshall W from the UK, Adam J from Canada, Daffy A from the UK, and Matthew B from the United States. So again, the UK continues to dominate the F1 Fantasy League rankings, but oddly, it's because I'm kind of losing my train of thought here. What I'm trying to say, Mr. Daly, is that there's a disproportionately large number of British listeners in the top 10 relative to where our listeners come from. So about a quarter of our audience is from the UK and about 50% of it's from the US. So to everyone listening in the US, like step up your game next year because I want to see represent only one American in the top 10 right now in Matthew B. So kudos to you, Yanko West and Adam J. But otherwise, it's being dominated by the Brits, which is awesome. But I would love to see some more North American representation in there next year, competing for the top spot and those amazing prizes that we haven't yet actually announced, despite promising to have done so for 8 months.
Cool. So just before we get into the news of the week, a couple quick shout outs. First of all, to JT the Human for that amazing intro music. So check him out on Apple Music or wherever you get your music from. Also, a quick shout out to the Race Weekend, who we're very, very supportive of. And if you want to get 10% off a subscription to the Race Weekend, go to theraceweekend.com and use our special promo code ScuderiaPod. And that is the Race Weekend. And Race Weekend is RACEWKND.com. All right. Hey, and just talking about things that are really, exciting, looking forward to, the FIFA World Cup is coming up in a couple of weeks here. Really excited about that. Obviously, Canada is back in it for the first time since 1986, which, it's a generational thing. We got a fairly strong team, so I think the goal is to progress past the group stage, and anything past that would be a bonus, but it's going to be a bit of a difficult grind. So this is always a difficult thing for me, right? Because being born in Canada, come from a British Dutch family, I identify very strongly with the Dutch side of my family. I lived there, lived in the UK as well, so it's like this three-headed monster like tearing me apart for loyalty. So it's yeah, difficult time, but it's going to be fun. Look, always love big tournaments like that of any kind. So very
I cannot
exciting
wait.
times.
I cannot wait. I still very specifically I think so in 86, I was living in Canada. That was the last time Canada qualified when the World Cup was in Mexico. And I was too young. I don't remember it, but I was living in the UK in 90 when it was in Italy. And I remember how the World Cup took over that country. And of course, we were here in 94. I was here in Canada in 94. We didn't qualify. We missed qualifying. I think we qualified pretty well that year, but we didn't obviously qualify for the World Cup, but we did relatively well in qualifying. I remember Brazil came to Edmonton for a friendly, and we showed well in that friendly.
Yeah.
But I remember how big the World Cup was in '94. But it's always been something that seemed to elude us, and everything just seemed to come together this time for Canada. And at the same time, I was super excited that the US qualified, super excited that we have Wales and we have England in. I'm very excited about this. And I don't subscribe to the broadcast network that is going to be showing the games in Canada, but I will for the World Cup. The cool thing is all of the games are in the daytime. So I've already had conversations with everyone at my work that on 3 specific days, I will not be taking meetings within certain times. And we're going to hang the big Canada flag outside of our house. We'll hang up the British flag. But yeah, man, super, super excited. And just something else to look forward to. I prefer my World Cup in the summer, but I'll take a World Cup in November and December.
Exactly. It's funny you should mention the World Cup 1990. I remember being in Holland that year to watch it, and I remember watching with my uncles and my cousins and stuff like that. And you remember that year? What was it? The quarterfinals or the semifinals? I guess it was when England lost to West Germany. It was still West Germany back then.
Yeah.
On penalties, and then there's that iconic photo of Paul Gascoigne crying and pulling his shirt up over his face. there's a really cool documentary. I can't remember, it was done by ITV or BBC. It's called Gaza's Tears, and it used to be on
Huh.
YouTube. It might have been removed, but if you go and search it up, because it's really cool, because it kind of talks about not it, I mean, that's kind of the climax, is that game against West Germany, how it goes to extra time, it goes to penalties and all that, and how sadly, if you're an English fan, that they lost that night. But it just talks about the whole journey, like when they qualified for the World Cup and they didn't really have um, I guess expectations were low that year, and they got on a bit of a roll, and how the whole country got behind. It was really cool. It was a real snapshot from, for me personally, for being young at the time, being a kid. Just it was just a really cool snapshot of a memorable time.
England was in a
All right.
funky group that year. I'm gonna
Yeah,
derail a
yeah.
little longer since we're
No,
because
no,
that's what
please,
people tuned
please.
in for, right? Was to talk about Italy 90. That was a funky year because England was in
Yeah.
Group F and they finished atop the group, but they finished atop the group with 1 win and 2 draws. The Republic of Ireland finished with 3 draws, Netherlands with 3 draws, and Egypt with 2 draws and a loss. So it wasn't like it was a powerhouse group, and England
Hmm.
just did just enough to squeak out, and of course the rest is history. But I promise that's enough with soccer. We'll move on to Formula One.
Yeah, but that's the thing, though, right? I mean, like 3 or 4 months ago, people would be all over us from derailing the comment or the discussion, not talking about Formula One. But considering that the championship's been wrapped up for so long,
Yeah.
I think hopefully people are going to cut us a little bit of slack. But anyways, let's drag this thing out of the gutter, drag it back on track here. So we got, Max obviously set the record last weekend at Autodromo Hermanos Rodriguez. 14 wins in a season. All the previous records that have been set by Seb, by Lewis. So pretty impressive. But also he's now set or scored the most points in a single year. So to date, with 2 races yet or left, Max has scored 416 points, which is 3 more points than Lewis scored in 2019 and 8 more than Lewis scored in 2018. Seb scored 397 in 2013. Max last year scored 395 or 396. We're not doing half points. I stand
I
by that
agree.
comment
Round it
that we
up.
made last. We'll round it
Round
up.
it up.
Max scored 396 points last year, and then Seb scored 392 way back in 2011. So that's pretty impressive. I mean, he could easily add another 50 points to that total before he's done if he wins this weekend and wins in Abu Dhabi in 2 weeks from now. So that is just amazing. All right. So looking now at the driver of the day winners, Max has won 5 of those this year in Holland, Miami, Hungary, at Imola, and Belgium. Charles has won 4 driver of the days in Saudi Arabia, Canada, Bahrain, and Australia. Sergio has won 3 times. Sebastian Vettel has won twice. Lewis has been driver of the day twice, and then drivers that have recorded 1 each include Sainz, Ricciardo, MSC, Mick Schumacher getting driver of the day in Austria, and then Nick De Vries, driver of the day at Monza several weeks back, and deservedly so. That was a pretty impressive drive from a guy that had never raced in a Formula One car before and brought it home in, what was it, 9th place? Pretty cool stuff. Okay, so, this is a big one. This one should probably hopefully take us to the break here in a couple of minutes. So the most mechanical DNFs in the turbo hybrid era. And this comes courtesy of at F1_charts. You can follow them on Twitter, Instagrams, and Facebook if anybody's still using Facebook. So in 2017, Fernando Alonso had a retirement percentage of 47.4%, meaning he retired once every 2.1 races. Kamui Kobayashi in 2014 had a 37.5% DNF, mechanical DNF rate, and that was once every 2.7 races. Carlos Sainz in 2015, when he was with Renault, was had a technical DNF in, what was that, 2015? So it was one every 2.7 races as well. Fernando in 2015, God, that was a year that I think Fernando would like to forget, and I think everybody else as well, because that was just painful to watch McLaren that year. His first year with the Honda Power, he retired once every 3 races, or 33.3%, and then just one more. Danny Ricciardo his first year. Well, no, actually, it wasn't first year. That was Red Bull, and that was with still with the Renault Power in 2018. He retired once every 3.5 races, or 28.6%. So going right down to the bottom. So the guy that finished the least, or had the least amount of technical DNFs in the turbo hybrid era, was Danny Kvyat, driving for Toro Rosso Renault back in 2017. He retired once every 5 races for 20%. So that's kind of a cool one. But that 2015 season for McLaren, that was pretty nasty.
Yeah, man,
Not
there's
one
an
to remember for sure.
awful lot of orange at the top of this chart. In fact, four of the top 7 most technical DNFs by a driver in the turbo hybrid era were McLarens, with Alonso in 2017, Alonso in 2015, as you noted, their first year with the Honda Power Unit, Alonso again in 2018, which I suppose would have been his last year before his brief departure, and then Jenson Button also in 2015. Yuck, a lot of McLaren orange on that chart.
I've got one loaded up here in the audio board. I should just see if it'll play. And
try 3 times, please, Fernando.
I try already, so try yourself.
Well timed.
Remember that? That was the Russian Grand Prix when the power unit failed on the formation lap and basically conked out on him, just turning around into start finish just past the pit entrance. And that was
soundboard worked.
Pretty embarrassing.
The soundboard came through for us for once.
Excellent.
Thank you, Mr. Burns. It was excellent indeed. Okay, moving along, should we actually get into some news story? And I think that we probably should at this point. So let me just dial up the first news story of the night. And this is kind of in response to Red Bull's boycott of Sky Sports. And that was after Ted Kravitz made some comments, repeated comments about Lewis Hamilton being robbed of the World Championship last year. So Martin Brundle, who's a commentator or a color commentator for Sky Sports F1, has criticized Red Bull for their boycott after their Sky's coverage of the Mexican Grand Prix last weekend, and actually stepped up and defended Ted Kravitz. And they did say that they're going to end this boycott after this weekend, or is it for this weekend? And I thought it was kind of a bit of a funny one too, and I talked about it with Tim Hauraney when I jumped on his podcast, or when we talked about in the post-race podcast earlier this week, that I've seen some pretty critical comments from my time in the media, but that's more soccer compared to Formula One. But I've never seen, like, I've seen individual people be banned, or athletes or coaches just wouldn't talk to them. I've seen reporters kind of mocked and kind of leered at by athletes and coaches. I've seen people had their credentials removed and banned, but I've never actually heard of sort of a blanket boycott by an organization like Red Bull did. So I can sort of kind of understand that they didn't like the comments, but to me it seemed like why now? What's the point? I understand Max saying that he felt there was constant disrespect, and that was what basically Red Bull was saying as well. But it seems like a too much of a reaction, or am I reading too much into that? What's your take, Hammy?
Not at all. I don't think you're overreacting at all. In fact, I think this entire situation reflects really badly on Formula One, and I think it reflects badly on the relationship between Sky and Formula One. I think it reflects really badly on Red Bull. And just to kind of put the Formula One car in reverse here, Ted Kravitz's comment was, and I'm going to quote here: Hamilton doesn't win a race all year and then finally comes back at a track where he could win the first race all year, battling the same guy who won the race he was robbed in the previous year, and manages to finish ahead of him. What a script and a story that would have been. But that's not the way the script turned out today, was it? Because the guy that beat him after being robbed actually overtook him because he's got a quicker car, because of engineering in Formula One and design, and pretty much because of Adrian Newey, Red Bull's chief technical officer, over there. So this apparently was the straw that broke the camel's back, and ultimately kind of prompted this response from Red Bull. But I think it's unacceptable. And I would make the same statement regardless of what team ultimately boycotted Sky Sports, that ultimately the broadcast partner should have full and total autonomy to criticize teams and to criticize the sport and to criticize the drivers. I think if if Sky Sports doesn't have the autonomy in the license to levy criticism, then this becomes a very WWE style entertainment product where the broadcasters and the broadcast partners and the sport are so deeply integrated as to be inseparable from one another. And I get that Sky's a big partner, but I don't think they do enough to criticize the drivers and the teams and the FIA and the sport. And I think it's their responsibility to do so as part of the media. And earlier this week,
100%.
earlier this week, I was watching the NBA on TNT, and I really appreciated that, despite the fact that TNT and the NBA are huge broadcast partners. I'm sitting there watching Charles Barkley lay in to, deservedly so, laying into Kyrie Irving and the Nets in action in terms of suspending him at the time, and the league's in action in suspending him at the moment. The Nets' response wasn't, "We are not going to take interviews with anyone on TNT," because TNT's responsibility is to be a broadcast partner, but also to be an established a media entity, and you need to be able to criticize and have an open dialogue. I think Red Bull's response here was just awfully, awfully, awfully petty, and it feels like they're trying to paint themselves as a victim. And we saw that a little bit with Christian Horner, and of course the whole cost cap fiasco, which we'll speak to in a minute. But I thought this was a little bit petty, and I would say that regardless of what team it is, that you have media obligations. Your media broadcast partners should be able to criticize you. They should be able to revisit situations in the past. And I think ultimately, probably what frustrated Verstappen and the Red Bull team the most was using the term robbed as a verb. But I think we could all argue, was that not what happened? And have we not all since kind of moved on because we all love Formula One and we put it in our rearview mirror because it was a human error? But we can still acknowledge that he was robbed at the time and that the rules weren't applied, and the FIA absolutely finally came out and admitted as much. But yeah, it's a little bit petty.
Yeah, like 100%. And there's obviously a line that's drawn where like a member of the media should not cross that line. I mean, obviously, if it's like a personal attack, if they're going out and just spewing vile, hateful things, and I mean, there was none of that. I mean, if you can't criticize fairly and you can't, yeah, I just don't know. I just can't even. I just find it's, like you say, I find it really petty as well. Like you say, if you draw that line of like what is unacceptable when it comes to what the media can and cannot say, this falls well short of that. I mean, it's not even close, right?
Daly, let me ask you a question. So you were a credentialed member of the media in this city covering Major League Soccer, and you were basically a local beat reporter for the Vancouver Whitecaps. Did you ever hold back criticism of that team for fear that maybe you weren't going to get access? Of course not, because you wanted to have integrity as a reporter over having accesses. Like, anyways, I get frustrated with this situation.
I mean, there was certain things that we wouldn't report. We wouldn't report things that were unsubstantiated or hearsay.
Of course.
We would not report the way, things in a certain way because of personal feelings of, either positive or negative. We were sometimes accused of being a little bit too positive, but, we never made personal like comments about like a coach or a player or a member of the organization, one of the front office staff or something like that. You just keep it professional. But we felt it was like anything other than that was fair game. He had a good game. He had a bad game. That was a good move the organization made in terms of a player trade or an acquisition, or that was a stupid move that they made, or they didn't make a move at all and that was good or it was bad. I think all of that stuff is well within the criticism, and we felt that, if we're going to deal out good commentary and praise, that you got to weigh that up with the bad. And sometimes when things, and depending what's happening, then sometimes that balance shifts back and forth, because they're never going to get it perfect 100% of the time. They're never going to get it wrong 100% of the time, and it's never even going to be a 50-50 thing, right? That the pendulum swings back and forth. It's just where you catch it on that arc. But you just keep it professional and just don't be a jerk is basically what it is. But I
Completely.
certainly don't think that Ted Kravitz said was anywhere over that line. So there's
I've
that.
argued so many times before that by and large the Formula One media as a body is far too
Hmm.
insulated, and they're far too close to the teams and the drivers. And I don't think that there's enough investigative journalism happening. And if there is,
No,
that work's
no.
not bubbling up to the surface. And I don't think there's enough criticism of from the media, from the established credentialed media. I don't think there's enough substantiated criticism because I think it's good for the sport and I don't think it's there. And you and I have talked about this so many times, but flashback to 2019,
Hmm.
Ferrari, we know was caught cheating, yet we don't know what they got caught cheating. We don't know what the penalty was. And if this was any other sport in the world, you would have had journalists from every corner of the planet trying to cut their teeth and get that story because it would propel their career forward. But in the world of
Yeah.
Formula One, nobody wants to compromise their credentials by asking the
No.
difficult questions. So they let it go. And I think the precedence here could potentially be, oh, if you're a Sky broadcast member, don't you now dare say anything critical of any driver or any team
Yeah.
because you're going to get blacklisted and you're going to lose your access. And I think this is how a lot of members of the media kind of operate, that I'm in the paddock, I've got my gold pass, I'm not going to say anything or do anything to compromise it. And that's not good for the integrity of the sport.
Yeah, you think the Fifth Estate would be all over this, right? Like there would be investigative journalists trying to break that through that wall of silence. And the closest that we got to the truth, which everybody assumed was an illegal fuel map, was divulged or slipped out of the mouth of former Ferrari driver Mika Salo during a Twitch
Yeah.
stream. I mean, how crazy is that? You would think that there would be some investigative journalism going on, but apparently not. Anyways, time to step away for a quick moment. We're just going to have a quick message from our sponsors. And then when we come back, we're going to come back and talk about our most favoritist thing in the whole wide world. And that is the budget breach. But this time, whereas I disagreed with Red Bull's take on the whole Kravitz thing, I do kind of agree with what Christian Horner said about the leak of the budget cap breach. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. So we'll be right back. Don't go away. All right, everyone, welcome back to the show. And yes, we are going to stick with the Red Bull because Christian Horner, team principal of Red Bull Racing, said it's quote unquote hugely worrying that the news of Red Bull's recent F1 got that totally wrong. Red Bull's recent budget cap breach was leaked, and I think that's fair, right? I mean, if that's a completely different story than to for them breaking the cost cap. We don't really need to get into that, but yeah, I find that a little bit problematic. I mean, I could have seen like the case for maybe like a whistleblower if Red Bull did some kind of like sneaky backroom deal, or we had a situation like we were just talking about before the break, like with the Ferrari and that situation with the power units back in 2019, and that really shady secret deal that they did with the FIA. I mean, I think everybody would be screaming and yelling and demanding more information, and everybody would be hoping that a whistleblower would come forward. But I mean, it wasn't just Red Bull, but also Aston Martin's name was thrown out there for the procedural breach. But I think that just I'm all for transparency, but I think in this case the FIA should have been had the opportunity to release it first. So who knows where that leak came from? It just smells a little bit fishy to me.
Yeah, I'm a little mixed on this one because, on the one hand, I'm demanding strong investigative journalism. And if
Hmm.
this was a story that was broken by a reporter because they had a source on the inside that was willing to
Yeah.
divulge information, that's just a great story. And kudos to the journalist. But on the other hand, that's not really, I think, what happened here. I think it was more that there are some folks on the inside, either with an accounting firm or with the FIA or with one of the teams or with Red
Hmm.
Bull themselves, that leaked this information out. And of course, that's what created the massive pandemonium and distraction in the 2 weeks leading up to the Wednesday when we were supposed to know if the cost cap compliance certificates were going to be distributed. And of course, that was bumped to the Monday after the Japanese Grand Prix. But certainly, if I'm the FIA, and the FIA is due a significant amount of criticism over the last year and a half. And again, when I say the FIA, I'm not talking necessarily about those folks working at the marshaling level in the field, dragging themselves out of bed at 5 a.m. on a Saturday to go out and do marshaling and to do coaching of open wheel racing and all that kind of stuff. I'm talking about the senior executive levels, the decision-making body at the FIA. They deserve a lot of criticism. And likewise, I think a lot of the noise and distraction from the last month was unnecessary simply because they couldn't contain this news story. The fact that it got out, admittedly, is not a good look for the FIA, especially since we still don't know where it came from. And like I said, if it was an investigative journalist that broke this story, that's fantastic. But I don't think that's even what necessarily happened here. And certainly it was members of the media that started reporting on this, but they were only reporting on hearsay and gossip that was happening within the paddock. But ultimately, it was a bad look, and Christian Horner's right to be upset. And I think all of the Red Bull team is, because obviously it was probably a big distraction for them. But at the same time, he was very, very aggressive in his dismissals of the criticism and his demands and insistence that they were on side, which was ultimately proven incorrect. But yeah, the FIA's got to figure out how to leak those holes or plug those holes.
Yeah, because it's not like I feel this is like completely different than that Ferrari thing a couple of years ago, because they did release in their announcement, they had, was it about 12 or 13 points of where the cost cap was breached. Some of them was like related to salary and like
100% agree. 100% agree.
It was very, very detailed. So I would have been, kind of a little bit more interested in like the numbers. But that's, what I saw, the preliminary sort of breakdowns and everything like that. But, I as much as I felt, frustration that, we're like year one in the cost cap, and we had two teams busted for procedural breaches and one team for a minor overspend. But still, like it, by the time like it was all sort of sorted and done with, that, I don't really feel that frustration or that sort of bitter taste in my mouth, because that whole Ferrari situation for a couple of years ago, just it doesn't sit well with me now. And it just, I just think it, maybe it was sort of like a transitional time in Formula One. Liberty already been in charge for a couple of years. I mean, fortunately, Bernie and the old regime was kind of long gone by then. I feel like there's more transparency now, but that whole situation still just, it just, it it just gets under my skin even today, like 3 years later.
If you recall, and I think a lot of our listeners may not have been watching Formula One at that point, but in the first half of the 2019 season, Ferrari looked like an absolute force, and they had more top end speed than any team on the grid. And then all of a sudden, at some point after the summer break, all of that power just vanished and they became an afterthought. And then they struggled significantly in the 2020 season. And what's understood is that something about their power unit wasn't compliant with the regulations, and the FIA became aware of it, and they ultimately administered a punishment that remains secretive to this day. But that said, all of the results that they were able to accrue leading up to the point where the punishment was handed down to them remained static, remained in place. So I think, to me, that's a hugely problematic moment for Formula One, and very, very different than this situation. And I'm still very upset and very angry about the Ferrari situation, because they clearly had a very significant competitive advantage that was working against the technical and possibly the sporting regulations, and that we've never had an explanation or clarification for what that obvious advantage was. And then we also don't know what the punishment was. I really dislike the lack of transparency. I think in this case, there's a huge amount of transparency. We know ultimately now, we know exactly what the breach was. We know exactly how it was documented, and the FIA followed the rule book as it was designed and engineered to apply a punishment. And ultimately, I think a lot of people are angry that the punishment itself didn't have more teeth, But I'm the only people I'm mad at for that are the teams for agreeing to the financial regulations as they were written. That, you know what, Ferrari can get angry and Mercedes can get angry, but you ultimately agree to the financial regulations that allowed this to be the outcome. And we could have modeled this, the teams, they could have modeled out this scenario themselves in the offseason, that
Yep.
what if a team overspent by X amount of money? What would the likely outcome be? And this is probably what you would have modeled out. So I'm not mad at the outcome. I'm mad at the teams for not insisting on financial regulations that would have had more teeth. So ultimately, Red Bull will take their, what was it, $7 million fine and the reduction in wind tunnel time, and they'll move on.
Yeah. Well, going back to 2019, I remember that race at Monza, and Charles, like, he was tag teams, like double teamed by Valtteri and Lewis all race long, and they just could not get enough just to pass him. I mean, it was a great win for Charles, but for me, it's tainted now. When you look at it in retrospect,
Absolutely.
it's just like, was that even a legal car that he was driving? I mean, he did a great job to stay ahead, and he's not the one that's going in there and monkeying around with the fuel map or the engine map, and or with the engine itself. So it's just it was exciting and fun to watch at the time. But if you look at like Barry Bonds' home run record or Mark McGuire and the asterisks beside all those
Oh, I
for all the
I love the
shenanigans.
steroid era, man. But the problem with the steroid era was, if you look at, say, 1998, if you
Yeah.
look at 99, like 2003, like Bond's big years, Major League Baseball had no rules outlawing the use of performance enhancing drugs. Like, that was all
Exactly.
on Bud Selig and the owners, because they embraced the offensive era. Anyways, to go back to that Ferrari piece, I just wanted to add one
Oh
other
man,
quick
I
piece.
wanted to talk about Barry Bonds a little bit more.
Dude, I'm still a big Barry Bonds fan. But just to go back to that Ferrari piece, the general consensus is that somebody tipped the FIA off to what was happening at Ferrari. So either it was a
Yep.
supplier, either it was an employee, or it was a former employee that had moved on to another team. And ultimately, the general consensus, or kind of general assumption or belief, is that the FIA approached Ferrari. The FIA themselves couldn't identify whatever it was that Ferrari were doing, and that Ferrari ultimately showed them. The Ferrari actually showed the FIA, with the promise of leniency. Ferrari showed them how they were breaching the sporting and technical regulations. And that's why they got off, because the FIA themselves couldn't detect what it was they were doing. And it was Ferrari that showed them, in the spirit of leniency. And that's why the punishment was non-existent. And that's why it all remains secretive to this day. At least that's what I believe happened, based on things I've been told off the record.
Yeah. It's funny because, kind of thinking back too, I seem to remember Max Verstappen at the Brazilian Grand Prix basically flat out came and said they're cheating.
Yeah.
Max, it is pulling no punches, kind of like no holds barred kind of comments. But anyways, let's move along. So the teams are actually discussing having a winter shutdown to basically help the well-being of their staff. Their staff. I mean, there's. I think this is a good idea. They have a 2-week shutdown during the summer break. That's in the rules. That's fast. That's fast and set. So that means that that team and staff members get time off through the middle of an extremely busy season, and it's not like one team gets like an advantage over another, because they all have to shut down. So, I mean, the rest of the time is they keep working basically the rest of the year. They do give people time off over Christmas and through the holiday period. But as part of the talks that they've had with the Formula One Sporting Advisory Committee, teams are represented by their sporting directors, and it's been proposed apparently that a winter shutdown could actually become a thing. So you and I, we talk about this. As much as we love the spectacle of Formula One, as much as we love to see racing all the time, we're going to potentially a 24 race season next year. And I only say potentially because there's a real possibility that China is going to drop off. We're not going to end up back in Shanghai. So we're only, and I say that somewhat, jokingly, with only 23 races. But that is a massive ask of not just the people in the pits, in the paddock, of the drivers, but everybody involved with the Formula One team, right from the person at the front desk to the engineers, the designers, everyone involved. That's still a massive, massive ask, despite the shutdowns and breaks that they have throughout the season.
Buddy, I have to eat some parrots because eat some parrots. I don't think that was the phrase I meant. I don't think that was the phrase.
Is eat some crow? Isn't that the
Eat
way
some
we try
crow.
to be
That's
humble?
not
Yeah,
eat
yeah.
some parrots. But yeah, I should I should display or demonstrate a little bit of humility
Gross.
because I have said on this show multiple times in the past that there is a mandatory winter break that is imposed upon the team in the sporting regulations, and I was totally wrong. We all know about the 2 weeks in the summer, which really stretches, at least from a broadcast perspective and a calendar perspective, to 3 or 4 weeks. But we all know that there's that mandatory shutdown in the summer. I always believed there was a shutdown in the back half of December, which is actually not correct. And I think a lot of teams probably do that just because it's convenient to align everybody's vacation calendar so everyone's off at the same time. But yeah, if it's not happening today, sure, why not make it happen?
Yeah, Toto was saying that they would like to see something starting at Christmas, so the last week of December, and going into the new year, into January for 2 weeks. So you could have potentially a 3 week break. So I know that would probably make a lot of extra pressure and long hours for the rest of the time. But I believe that the motivation is sincere, and it's the teams wanting to look after the well-being, both mental and physical well-being of the people that work for the teams, because as much as I think that all of us say, hey, it'd be great to have a job in Formula One, would we really want to? Because I have a feeling that if you're really in the thick of it, that this is a 24/7 365 kind of thing. It's either all in or you're not, because the demands there are just going to be, and the pressure, of course, is just going to be monumental. I mean, we look at like the NFL season going from Labor Day until, well, Super Bowl's basically middle of February, but I mean, they don't stop. I mean, it goes all year round, and it's a big thing for people at the top, regardless what elite level of sport it is. So I think this is potentially a good thing. All right. So moving along to the next one. So Formula One is apparently set to drop the rule change for 2023 that apparently no drivers want. Do you want to talk about this one, Hanny? Or
I do, because
you
this
got
whole
that look on
topic,
your face.
it
So
makes me very sad. I'm a huge advocate for tire blankets, and this story comes from the race.com, the fantastic Ed Straw, and I quote, F1 set to drop 2023 rule change that quote unquote no driver wants. And if you don't know and you're not aware, Formula One, Pirelli, Liberty, the FIA are in I would say, the initial stages moving towards removing tire blankets from the sport altogether. So Pirelli is busy trying to engineer and design tires that can be truly functional without the the benefit of having a tire blanket. And of course, tire blankets consume a ton of electricity. So from a sustainability perspective, I think the FIA, Liberty want to get rid of tire blankets as well. So in the process of getting to that future state where they'll be banned by 2024, they've been slowly reducing the effectiveness of the blankets. So last year, I think they reduced the tire blankets from about 100 degrees at the front and 80 degrees at the rear. And then this year, they're only, I think, powering the blankets to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, front and rear. So they're slowly ratcheting down the effectiveness of the blankets leading up to 2024, when tire blankets will be banned. And what they did recently was a couple of tests at the 50-degree Fahrenheit temperature that they plan to run the blankets at next year. And I think the feedback from the drivers was specifically that is way too cool, and it leads to incredibly dangerous driving conditions and characteristics when they come out of the pits. So the plan was that next year they were going to cut down the tire blanket temperature to 50 degrees. I was saying Fahrenheit, but I clearly meant Celsius. The plan was that next year they were going to cut down the tire blanket temperatures to 50 degrees Celsius front and rear. They are not going to do that because of the feedback from the drivers, and they'll keep them at 70 degrees Celsius. All of that said, though, the FIA, Liberty, Formula One, they still have all intentions of completely removing tire blankets from 2024 onwards. And of course, these tests that they're doing on the side are really important because Pirelli needs to be able to design and engineer a drive or a tire that can be relatively functional and perform relatively well cold, because these tires are going to be coming right off the rack, straight on the car, and go straight on the track. And I think the reason that I like tire blankets is I love the fact that the drivers can come out of the pits and drive hard right from the jump. What's going to
Hmm.
change now, of course, is that for a lot of these drivers, unless the tires are significantly reworked, and I don't know how Pirelli's necessarily going to be able to do that, at least initially, when drivers come out of the pits, when they come out of a pit stop, they are going to be driving as if they are on ice for the first 4, 5, 6, 7 laps until they get the tires up to optimal operating temperature. So it's going to be a real shift and a real change to Formula One in the way that the teams approach strategy and pit stops and tire selection.
Yeah, it's interesting because Tim and I talked about this last week a little bit too. And I'm in favor of getting rid of tire blankets only in the situation that they can develop a tire that performs well when it's cold,
Yeah.
because obviously these ones don't. And because I like the idea that these are supposed to be the best drivers in the world, so kind of like take away some of these, I don't want to call crutches, but some of these, make
They're
them work
driver aids.
for
They're
us.
driver
Yeah,
aids,
they're
right?
driver aids. Sure, let's call them driver aids, but not if it compromises safety. I mean,
Right.
safety always
That's
has to
fair.
be at the top of the list. So I mean, this is a significant engineering challenge for Pirelli, and there's obviously a lot of pressure on them to get it right. And it'll be interesting to see where it goes. I mean, is it too much of an ask for them to do this? I don't know. So I mean, this will be an interesting story to follow as it develops, to see what are the challenges that the tire manufacturer are having themselves to find that right combination of ingredients, that right recipe to get that magic tire compound, that rubber formula that will work without the use of a driver, the tire warmers. And yeah, I know it's kind of nerdy to think about it and talk about it, but it's also really, really interesting, because I mean, obviously they didn't have it back in the day, but you know it's, I don't know.
This
It's an interesting twist in Formula One, I
as
think.
as you were talking, Daily, and I was listening because I'm a good podcast co-host, something occurred to me, and it's that I keep looking ahead to the next couple of years, so 2023, 2024, 2025, and I keep thinking there's nothing truly transformational happening. Obviously, 2026 we get the new power unit regulations, which is something that we're going to look
Yeah.
forward to and speculate and talk about quite a bit. But 2024 is going to be a really transformational year in itself, because we're going to be going into an era where all these Formula One drivers are going to have to operate on effectively cold tires without tire blankets. Like, that's a big shift. And obviously, we're supposed to ratchet down the effectiveness of the tire blankets next year, which, as the story from Ed Straw indicates, won't be happening. But all of a sudden, we're going to pull away that blanket benefit, that blanket driver aid entirely for 2024. And it's going to be fascinating to see, to your point, what type of tire Pirelli is going to be able to engineer. And then it'll be interesting to see how the teams engineer their suspensions in the cars to reflect the fact that they're not going to be on hot tires straight out of the pit stop. And then ultimately, to your point as well, that if we really are talking about the best drivers in the world, it'll be really interesting to see who can adapt to that new world of Formula One when they don't have the driver aid of a hot tire blanket on the tires all the time.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that for me is the kind of, I think the real interesting part of it is just how good, like who would be good at this and who wouldn't. But again, they have to get to the point that they've developed a tire that can actually do the job and not be an obvious, safety risk. Okay, let's take another quick break. When we come back, still plenty of things to talk about, and we're going to go over to Haas for a little bit. So hang on, we'll be back in just a moment. All right, welcome back to the podcast. It is always up to speed with Formula One. So, as mentioned before the break, that we're going to talk about Haas and Stoffel van Dorn, most recently in Formula E, former Formula One driver, is set to join Aston Martin for next season as a reserve driver. And that could be perhaps bad news for someone like Mick Schumacher, who probably will not be back with Haas next season. And this is kind of an interesting one. I've kind of often wondered about Stoffel Vandoorne. That hasn't been something I've thought about a lot, but he was, he came into Formula One at just the wrong time, because he filled in for a race or two. When was that? In 2015. Remember when Fernando had that horrible accident in Australia, the first race of the year? The car came apart.
2016.
2016.
Yeah, 2016.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so, I mean, it was incredible the way that car just disintegrated and came up to rest against the tire barriers. I guess that would be what, in turn 3 or 4, where it kind of goes from that sharp right-hander into the left-hander again. Anyways, Fernando was a little bit kind of banged up after that one, even though he walked away and fortunately was all right. But Stoffel came in, filled in for him the next race in Bahrain, and I think he scored a P10.
He scored points. He got P10.
Which was fantastic for a young driver like that. Eventually he does get a drive with McLaren, but right at the time when they were not at, they weren't in a good spot. Like, this is kind of, before the real whole Zach Brown thing happened. You still had Eric Boulier there, who was like the team principal, and everything that they tried to do, it just wasn't going well. And we talked about a little bit earlier about the, some of the frustrations and obviously the things that were happening when Fernando was there. I played that clip at the Russian Grand Prix, although that might have been the year after that. I mean, the thing is, he didn't obviously make, well, I think he did his best, but it just obviously didn't work out, and then eventually parts ways with McLaren. But he's done well in Formula E over the past several years, but now coming back to Formula One as a reserve driver, kind of getting his foot back in the door. And especially Aston Martin is kind of an interesting team. You got Lance there next year, you got Fernando there. Might not be a bad place for a guy that's looking to rejuvenate his career and maybe restart it and get back into Formula One car one day. What do you think?
Yeah, it's funny, and I've shared this story before, but I was actually at the Williams factory in September of 2016. So at the time, they had Valtteri Bottas and Felipe Massa as their driver lineup, and at that point, it had already been announced that Felipe Massa was going to retire, but they hadn't announced who was going to replace him. And I had on pretty good authority at that point it was going to be Lance Stroll, because he was going to bring so much money, and he was on his way at the time to winning the F3 championship. But everyone at the factory in Grove, where the Williams factory is based, were incredibly excited about the prospect of bringing in Stoffel Vandoorne. And everyone we talked to, Stoffel. That team was very much invested in him, or they weren't, and it was an incredible smokescreen to distract from the fact that it was always going to be Lance Stroll. But that always kind of resonated with me, and I always felt he was dealt a bit of an unfortunate card, not an unlucky card, because if you get the opportunity to drive an F1, you sign with whatever team. Like you don't have the luxury of turning down a drive, right? So he took the drive that was available to him. And unfortunately, as you and I have discussed so many times, like 2015, 16, 17, 18 was just an atrocious time to be driving a McLaren car that you're driving. His first year, he was driving with that Honda power unit, in the year with that massive reliability issue. The next year, they made that not short-sighted, but kind of quick, rapid switch over to the Renault power unit. And of course, he was partnered with Fernando Alonso, and there was a ton of distractions because Fernando was being so toxic within the team. Like, it was a bad time to be a driver. And as a young rookie in F1, like, you really want to be in a situation where the environment is stable, and it wasn't a stable environment. And you want to be in a team where there's a driver that you can learn from. And I don't think that I don't think that Fernando was a nurturing type of fellow that was there to share data and telemetry and share best practices when you're doing a track walk. It was a bad situation. But what's really juicy about this, of course, is that Stoffel Vandoorne is going to Aston Martin. And well, that's bad news for Mick Schumacher. And the reason it's bad news for Mick Schumacher is because Stoffel Vandoorne is going to displace the current Aston Martin reserve driver, who happens to be Nico Hülkenberg. So Nico Hülkenberg, with 180 Formula One Grand Prix starts, could now very well be on his way to Haas to fill that second seat next to Kevin Magnussen, which would mean all of the chairs, like if we're playing that game of musical chairs, there's no chairs left. And that means Mick Schumacher will be out of Formula One, at least as a full-time driver, because I think this tells the story that Aston Martin were looking for a reserve driver to replace Nico. And if they're looking to replace Nico, it's only because he's got to drive with Haas next season.
Yeah, he's got something sorted out. But I mean, we'll talk about, maybe this is a good time to kind of parlay this one into a discussion about Danny Ricciardo, because Nico obviously has been he's been kind of the guy that you tap on the shoulder if one of your drivers comes down with COVID the last couple of years. And so I mean, well, no, I mean, it's true.
It's so true. It's so true.
And I don't I don't mean to kind of like throw shade at Nico or kind of make a joke of it, but I mean, he had a full-time drive with Force India up until a couple of years ago, and it's kind of filled in here or there. But I mean, he's obviously over 30 now. So if you're Danny Ricciardo, who basically said, in the last couple of days that he's 100% confident he won't be on the grid next year, then if you're Danny looking at what happened to Nico Hulkenberg, that hasn't had a full-time year or drive in a couple or several years, then maybe it's not the end of the world. Maybe you don't fall off the radar that quickly. Yeah, it certainly is interesting. But now Mick Schumacher certainly looks like the odd man out. I mean, I can't imagine that Nico is just going to walk away. I mean, he's a guy that's got a ton of F1 experience, and I mean, he's done a pretty good job as a reserve driver. And if you still want to keep your name in Formula One, you still want to be involved, then that seems like a pretty good place to be if you're still looking for that full-time drive. So I completely stand behind what you're speculating and thinking about too, is that he's going over to Haas, and Mick is without a drive next year. So let's talk about Danny now. So he said, I can confidently say I won't be on the grid behind a wheel next year. I guess this is news that isn't really news. I guess we just really needed to hear it from Danny's mouth himself. But I just can't help but think that race that he had in Austin last weekend, despite the fact that he punted Yuki off the track and got the 10-second penalty, I mean, he was driving with fire in the belly, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, this was the race that I think that so many people wanted to see from Danny Ricciardo from the last year, 2 years. I don't know. I feel like this was something that really was a long time coming. Now, whether he can deliver that again this weekend in Brazil or in Yas in a couple of weeks, I don't know. But I liked what I saw from Danny Ricciardo. After it was all said and done, he ends up in P7. I'm like, this is, and ahead of his teammate who was P9. That's exactly the sort of stuff we wanted to see from Daniel Ricciardo, and sadly just a little bit too late. And who knows, maybe might be the one of his last performances ever in a Formula One, which I think would be doubly disappointing. Nothing further to add. I just got the thumbs up.
You got the thumbs up. Next topic.
Got the thumbs up. Next topic, indeed. Okay, so well, let's keep talking about some of the young Formula One drivers. So, according to Eric van Haren, Dutch motorsport journalist, I believe, with De Telegraaf, says that Nick de Vries, who's going to AlphaTauri next year, will be working with race engineer Pierre Hamelin and trainer Piri Samela, who is working beside Pierre Gasly, and De Vries will also be working with Pierre's manager Guillaume Le Goff and his agency. So sounds like Nick, he isn't even like he firmly is in Formula One, but it sounds like he's getting everything all sorted out. I'm really looking forward to seeing what Nick de Vries can do in Formula One. Talked about a little earlier that amazing performance he had at Monza. I mean, he's been pretty solid in Formula E. And it's kind of funny, like when you think that he's been in that Mercedes organization and he's going to AlphaTauri, because it's kind of funny. I find it a little bit ironic, right? Because Pierre is now going to Alpine. We've talked about it, you and I, quite a bit over probably the last year. That just wondering, how will Pierre do when he kind of gets out of that that silo that is Red Bull, and is able to maybe kind of get a little bit of freedom, and it's almost seems a little bit kind of funny to kind of flip that and put that on Nick de Vries going from Mercedes, which I never feel like anyone's really restricted there, but he kind of obviously hit the ceiling. And I think that Alpha Tauri, they've sometimes punched above their weight, so be interesting to see what Nick can do over there. Okay, so let's talk about here Nick Latifi. So this is he's obviously coming to the end of his time in Formula One, and sounds like Nicky is pretty much adamant in saying that he doesn't want to be a reserve driver in Formula One if he's not going to get a full-time drive. So why don't you take this one up a little bit further, Hammy?
Yeah, I don't think there's a lot to comment on here. I think his expectation was that he probably wants to be a full-time driver or have a pathway to being a full-time driver in Formula One. Um, I don't think that there are any opportunities for him that would pave the way to him resuming his career as a full-time F1 pilot. I think he had a 3-year run, and I don't think that when you look specifically at how he stacked up against his teammates, whether it was George Russell the first 2 years or if it was Alex Albon in the third year, I don't think there's enough meat on the bone to create a compelling reason for a team to invest in him. And a team might be willing to take him on as a test driver for test days and for practice sessions and to be a backup driver, sure. But I don't think anyone in Formula One's currently looking at Nicky as a potential driver for their team. There's just too much young talent and too many drivers that are trying to find their way onto the Formula One grid. Nicky did comment earlier today as well, and I don't have the quote on me, but he did make a comment earlier today about the fact that Indy could be the next kind of natural step to him. And I think I have to think that it probably wouldn't be stock car racing, but if he wants to continue his career as an open wheel racing driver at the highest level, I think Indy's probably the right place to do it. And I think given the fact that Indy races in Canada, of course, we have the Toronto race, and given the fact that Indy gets a significant amount of exposure up here, and I think with the sponsorship dollars that he could take to an Indy team, I think that could be good for his career. And of course, Indy's not a spec car series. You've got a couple of different power unit manufacturers in Chevy and Honda. But I think there's a lot more parity, and I think there's a lot more competitive balance. I would be very interested to see just what type of racing driver he is when he's not driving arguably the worst car on the grid. I would love to be able to see him go over to Indy and experience some degree of redemption by competing for podiums like he did in his final year in Formula 2. But yeah, I don't think there's a Formula 1 drive available to him. I also think that he'd be a great member of the media, but I think he's still young enough, and I think there's still enough funding to find his way into another seat in a competitive open wheel racing series.
Absolutely. Okay, I wanted to pull up another one here, and we talked a little bit. We've talked a little bit about Lewis Hamilton and a little bit about Fernando Alonso. So the Lewis had tweeted a picture of him and Fernando a couple of days ago, back when they were at McLaren together. Hammy, why don't you explain this one? Because honestly, I've missed out. I didn't see the original tweet, and I didn't see Lewis's comments about it.
Yeah, this one was a little bit juicy, and I always pretend I'm not that guy that loves kind of the juicy, gossipy side of Formula One, but I'm the first person to retweet this kind of stuff. But obviously, if you didn't pick up on it last week, Fernando Alonso made some comments that diminished the value of at least 6 of Lewis Hamilton's 7 world championship trophies. And Lewis responded by posting a photo of he standing on the top step of the podium in 2007 when he was racing with McLaren, looking down at Fernando Alonso, who was second in that race, and placing his hand on his shoulder. And I thought it was like the ultimate flex, ultimate humble brag, and ultimate shot at Lewis. But Lewis, after the Mexican Grand Prix, when he was doing his media obligations, was actually asked by a member of the media to kind of react to some of Alonso's comments and to also comment on the fact that he tweeted out this picture, which was obviously in response to Fernando's comments. And Lewis was good. And he basically said, like, look, you know what? I've always tried to be incredibly respectful of Fernando and his accomplishments and basically give him his flowers when they're due. But for
Mm-hmm.
some reason, Fernando obviously has an issue or continues to hold a grudge against Lewis for the outcome of that 2007 championship, which you and myself and Bird, I think, discussed at length when we were doing the
We
book
did,
review
yeah.
for the mechanic, right?
Yep.
So if you haven't heard that, go back and check it out. It's very, very cool. But I think Fernando, I think he holds a bit of a grudge because I think in a lot of ways he feels that Lewis cost him his third consecutive championship that year. And of course, didn't end well. And Fernando ended up leaving McLaren after a single year. But I think there's also a little bit of bitterness because from 2014 through 2020, 2021, really, Lewis just ran the table in Formula One and captured 6 titles. And during that time, of course, Fernando departs Ferrari, where he contended for at least 2 titles, but ends up going to McLaren. And we all know what a disaster 15, 16, 17, and 18 were for he and that team. And he ultimately kind of talked himself out of Formula One with some of the negativity that he was spewing when he was with McLaren. But during that entire period, Hamilton's just winning and winning and winning. So I think there's clearly some bitterness between the two of them. But I think if there's bitterness from Hamilton to Alonso, he does a much better job of concealing it. And Fernando is just outwardly very clear that he doesn't have a lot of respect for Lewis Hamilton as a Formula One 7 times world champion.
Yeah, I just double checked. So if you want to get a little bit more background on that, go back to episode 362 from earlier this summer, where we sat down with Bird Pinkerton and we reviewed the Mechanic, a book by former McLaren mechanic Mark Elvis Priestley, which was a pretty cool read, which we enjoyed, and we talked about that season with Lewis and Fernando at length. Okay, one more story, then we're going to take a quick break. We'll come back. We'll talk about the Brazilian Grand Prix this weekend. But this last one, this is a NASCAR story, and this is really kind of like crazy. But Ross Chastain, he floored it and slingshotted himself around the wall to go from 10th to 5th to advance to the championship in the NASCAR playoffs. This is just a really crazy. I've watched this video.
Yeah, me too.
A couple
so
of times. Many times. I've watched the in-car camera. I've watched the TV feed. It is pretty crazy. Like Ross talks about how he tried stuff like this, played like on video games. I mean, it is pretty cool to watch, and it's just amazing. The in-car camera is just crazy. The way that he goes up against the wall and just like really slingshots around that corner.
It's
really cool.
It's incomprehensible because, of course, he's trying to qualify for the NASCAR playoffs, and he has basically seconds to make up X number of places, and there's one opportunity to do it, which is to basically slingshot himself across the wall, and he's grinding the one side of the car along the wall the entire time, makes up 5 places and qualifies for the playoffs. So again, I know most of you probably aren't big NASCAR fans, and I'm not going to pretend to be a big stock car racing fan, but this was awfully cool, and one of those moments that transcends that discipline of motorsports.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's one of those things that you don't have to really be like a hardcore fan and understand all the nuances. I mean, to sort of like appreciate genius and brilliance, right? And I thought that was very cool. Like you say, it's sort of like one of those transcendent moments, and very cool. I mean, just go and search it up on social media. It's or on YouTube. It's all over the place. All right, time for a quick final break, and then come back talk about the Brazilian Grand Prix. We'll do so in just a moment, so don't go away. We'll be right back. Okay, guys, welcome back into the last segment for the show this week. Of course, we'll have the post-race show on Sunday night, but we're back to Brazil again. We had a Brazilian Grand Prix last year, and of course, sort of kind of not over the previous couple of years. So this will be the 50th Brazilian Grand Prix, first held way back in 1972. The driver that has won the most is French driver Alain Prost. The professor won their 6th time. The winningest constructor is McLaren with 12 wins. It is a 4.31 kilometer or 2.68 mile long circuit. Race length is 305.88 kilometers or 190.06 miles, 71 laps. Last year we had Valtteri Bottas on pole. Podium was Lewis Hamilton, Max Verstappen, and Valtteri Bottas. Sergio Perez set the fastest lap with a 111.010. So you go back and look at some of the great names that have won this race. I mean, it's funny too with some of the races that we lost multiple years because of COVID. We only lost the Brazilian Grand Prix once in 2020. So that's, I think, a bit of a testament to getting it back. It's a bit of an old school track. It's kind of narrow and it's not as flashy as some of the newer tracks, but I like this circuit, Hammy. It's got some great flowing corners. It's got some tighter technical sections. It's got some nice elevation change to it. And the setting there between the two lakes, Interlagos, is literally means between two lakes in Portuguese. I think it's a great race, a great racetrack, great location. The Brazilian fans are always passionate. Some very memorable moments there. Remember Felipe Massa when he retired in 2016, that very emotional walk down the pits, and that was the year that he retired but unretired. But that was really kind of an emotional moment because that was before he was persuaded to come back and not retire. But that was really quite something because his wife and his son were there in the Williams garage to meet him. And yeah, it was one of those things, like I had a big lump in my throat. I must admit that was quite the emotional moment. But just taking a look here at the weather forecast, had it up here a second ago. So for Saturday, we are looking for qualifying in the afternoon. We are looking at about 16 degrees Celsius with about a 20% chance of precipitation. I can't see where the toggle is for Fahrenheit. Apologize for that. So Sunday, we are looking about the same. We're looking at about, so mid-afternoon, we are looking at about 14% chance of precipitation, a high of 18 degrees Celsius. And like I say, I don't have the immediate conversion. Oh, here we go. I'll just flip it here into Fahrenheit. So this is what it's going to be, about mid 60s, something like that. We'll see if we can get this. Yeah, so it's going to be about 65 degrees Fahrenheit for race time on Sunday afternoon. Doesn't look like there's a big chance of rain here, Hammy, but we've seen some downpours here in the past, and we've seen this race come to a grinding halt. And I think it was 2016 when it was a
Max
wet race.
Verstappen.
Exactly, you knew exactly where I was going with that. That was some brilliant stuff that we saw from Max that year. But regardless if it's wet or dry, I mean, Toto said that he doesn't expect Mercedes to be as competitive this weekend as they were at in Mexico City last weekend. You know, again, it's just like I find it so difficult to put my money on anybody other than Max Verstappen and Red Bull at the moment. And Mercedes were saying that they would take, just getting a race win over position in the championship, in the constructors. And it seems really, really weird at this point in the season. We've had 20 races now or whatever it is, that we haven't talked once about a Mercedes victory. And if you said that to me even 12 months ago, that we might be looking at a year that Mercedes didn't record a win, I would have been like, Hammy, do you really want to think about that? Maybe walk those comments back, because that's not going to happen. But here we are. We got 2 races left in 2022, and there is a real good possibility that Mercedes is not going to score a victory this year. That blows my mind, I must admit.
It definitely doesn't look like Red Bull is turning down those power units. They've got nothing to preserve because they're going to start with a fresh supply of power units next year. Turn them up and shoot for the stars, because they have nothing to lose with 2 races left. And I think what we saw last weekend was probably the opportunity that Mercedes wanted. And I can't necessarily criticize any team for their strategy during that race. I think if the tires had worn as quickly as was predicted by the modeling that the teams used, Lewis could have been in position for a race win if Max had to pit that second time, which of course never happened. But I don't see Mercedes picking up a race win in Abu Dhabi, and I certainly don't see them picking up a race win in Interlagos. A couple of things I just wanted to add about this track, and I feel like I was doing dishes earlier and I was thinking about this, because it feels sometimes that we focus a lot on the really poor tracks on the championship, like Monaco, which is just a procession. It's just super boring. But the more I thought about it, there's some really great tracks on the calendar, and we have a lot of reasons to be thankful. Obviously, we had a great race in Japan, and we go from Japan to Austin, which is super fun and a great racing
Mm-hmm.
circuit. And we go to Mexico City, which is unique, and it's in a specific challenge because it's so slippery and because of the elevation. And then we go to Brazil, which has a high elevation and it's often wet and it's got a ton of elevation. Like there's a lot of reasons to be excited. And if you're still new to Formula One, and even if you're not, there's a lot to look forward to. And if you have the opportunity to race this track at F1 2023, or if you ever get the opportunity to sit in an iRacer sim, I think the characteristics of this track that I find so special are the elevation. It feels, and I've used this term before, and it's probably a little bit hyperbolic, but this track feels to me like a roller coaster. And you start on that racing grid and you run towards the first turn in the Senna S. And it's funny because it's not a long straight before you have to turn in, but you're turning in and going downhill simultaneously. And it's ultra challenging to find your braking point, especially because you've got a full load of fuel at that first corner the first time. You're coming in at 220 kilometers an hour instead of 320 kilometers an hour as you would on a flying lap. And you've got to find your spot, find your line, and you're diving downhill. And then it's into turn 3. You've got that long sweeping turn, and it's a high speed straight into corner 4 and 5. And then sector 3 is from turn 12 really all the way up to the start finish line. It's just an all out full throttle top gear sector. Like it's just such a great track. And it was built a long time ago. That this track is 80 years old now, probably a little under 80 or maybe a little over 80 years old. And of course it's been modified and changed and revised over the years, but this is a historically great racing circuit. And we've seen a lot of wet races here in 2016. I'm glad you brought that up because I was watching a video with Nico Rosberg earlier today, and he was talking about that 2016 race, and it was wet. And of course it was just it was Max's second season of Formula One. He'd won earlier that year. He'd taken his maiden victory in Spain when the two Mercedes had taken each other out. But Nico was talking about the fact that he's sitting there behind the safety car, and behind him is Max. And Nico's like, it is so wet and the track is so unpredictable. He's like, I'm just keeping the car straight because I'm so worried about aquaplaning. And he's looking behind him in his mirrors, and Max is just going everywhere, back and forth, side to side on the track, because he was so brave that he was trying to find the part of the track with the most traction so he would know what line to take when the race recommenced. It's a great circuit. I'm looking forward to it, but I don't expect anything short of a Red Bull dominant performance this race weekend, as we've seen all season. Still worth tuning in because I think it's a spectacular track.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm impressed that you knew the how old this track was while you're talking there. I had to go and check that out. So they broke ground in 1938, and it formally opened on May 12th, 1940. Which was actually 82 years ago. So that is a very, when we say it's old school, I mean,
Mark,
this is.
I've read Wikipedia earlier today. That I did not pull from the old brain box.
No, but that's kind of a cool stat. I really had no idea that it was that old. I thought that it dated back to the early 70s to when they the first Brazilian Grand Prix, because they had the Brazilian Grand Prix there from 72 to 77, and then again they had like a 10-year hiatus, or from 1980 to 1990. Then they went back there in 1990, and then of course we had a year off. But just looking at the tire selection, so it's going to be the mid-range of the Pirellis, the C2 hard, a C3 medium, and the C4 soft. Yeah, very much like you say, Hammy. I can't see anybody else beating Red Bull at the moment. But who knows? Maybe something will happen on race day. Maybe this isn't a track that suits them, but that doesn't seem like a very wise thing to say, because there haven't been too many tracks that haven't really suited the Red Bull this week. This year. They certainly have been dominant almost right from the very first corner, from the very first race of the year, and here we are. 21 races later, or whatever it might be. I mean, I just have lost track. I mean, it has been such a busy season. So yeah, I guess we'll see. Yeah, I'm thinking Max will win this one. Why not? He's won 14 other times this year. I'm thinking Sergio P3, and then I think Charles gets on the podium. I think Charles is going to score a P2. I think he's going to be fired up. Ferrari were disappointing last weekend. I don't know why. Maybe it's due to the fact that I'm wearing a red shirt, so I'm getting like this track top. So maybe I'm sort of subliminally influencing myself as I see my picture in the virtual studio on my screen here. That it's influencing my choice to go with a Ferrari for P2 this weekend. So, anyways, Hammy, anything else you want to add to that, or do you want to just give your usual shout out? That you usually do at this time of week.
Yeah, my usual shout out. If you enjoy this show, and I know you do because you're still listening after an hour and a half of the two of us rambling away, we would be honored if you could jump onto Spotify and give us a rating. If you could jump onto Apple Podcasts and give us a rating and a review. And to everybody that has done so in the last couple of weeks, trust me, it means the world to both of us. We both very, very, very much appreciate it. A couple of quick updates as well. We are inching closer and closer to getting our first taste of our merch. So we're hoping to see that shortly in the next couple of weeks. And we can make some decisions about what we're going to produce and how much the costs are going to be. And a lot of you have actually reached out because last year during November and December, we did a flurry of holiday contests. In no small part because we wanted to increase our Twitter following, but we should probably looking at doing a couple of holiday contests again this year. Maybe we can partner with some of our friends and do some artwork or a magazine subscription, but we'll definitely take a look at something like that. But other than that, that's all I got. This was great. We could wrap up this triple header. We get a couple of weeks off, then we're off back to the Middle East to conclude the season, and then it's the winter break. And then in no time, we'll be back here talking about all of the news and stories leading into winter testing 2023.
And then looking forward to the car launches that always come out sort of mid-February or so, which is always a fun time, especially when you see some of the leaked photos and things that come out in the days before, and some of the mock-ups that some of the more technically adept people come up with over the winter months. Anyways, before we sign off here, just want to give you a reminder. If you want to get in touch, send us an email, scooteryf1pod@gmail.com, or catch us on Twitter at scooteryf1pod. And that's a wrap. Enjoy your weekend. Enjoy the race. We'll be back here on Sunday night to recap the race. And until then, have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you soon again real